I never told my daughter's ex-boyfriend that I spent 30 years hunting the worst monsters on Earth as a United States Marshal. To him, I was just a frail 70-year-old man who drove a beat-up, rusted 1996 Chevy pickup. He threatened my family. He told me he would ruin my daughter and burn my house to the ground if she ever tried to leave him. She left anyway. And when he showed up at my property in the dead of night with his hired muscle, well, let us just say my wife and I were waiting for him on the porch. The text message from Celia came in at exactly 2 in the afternoon. It held just 3 words. "Dad, please hurry." I didn't call her back. When a message like that arrives from your child, you don't stop to ask questions. You move. I snatched my keys, headed out to the driveway, and swung up into my rusted 1996 Chevy pickup. Welcome back to Grandpa's Revenge. Glad you found your way here today. If you've been with me for a while, you know what this channel is about. And if you're new, well, you picked a good one to start with. Do me a small favor and tap subscribe so the next story finds you without you having to go looking for it. Quick question before we get into it. Are you listening through headphones right now, or are you letting the room hear this one with you? Either way, settle in because this story earns the quiet. One thing I want you to know before we begin: some details in this story have been shaped for storytelling, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is purely coincidental. What carries through is the truth of it, and that part is very real. The engine coughed before finally catching a sound I'd long since made my peace with. I pushed that old truck as hard as I dared, making the drive into the city faster than I had any right to. Grant Kellner kept a place in one of those gleaming glass and steel luxury high-rises in Charlotte, North Carolina, the kind of building where the doormen sport tailored jackets and regard you like something tracked in off the sidewalk. I nosed my battered truck straight into the loading zone and left it there, ignoring the valet's frantic gestures. I let my limp show as I crossed the lobby, rolling my shoulders inward to shave a few inches off myself to read older, smaller. People look right through you when they decide you're just a harmless old man. I rode the elevator up to the penthouse level. The doors parted and the hallway's extravagance washed over me, but I had no time for it. Celia's door was slightly ajar. I nudged it open and walked in. The apartment was spotless, cold, and stripped of warmth, but the living room itself was in pure chaos. Celia was jamming clothes frantically into a single battered nylon duffel bag, her hands trembling so badly she could hardly work the zipper. She looked up the moment I entered, and the raw panic in my little girl's eyes put a vice around my chest. She looked hollowed out, exhausted, frightened, diminished. "I'm ready," she whispered, her voice barely holding together. "We have to go before he gets back from his meeting." I nodded slowly, playing the part of the cautious, hesitant old father. I shuffled over and lifted the bag from her hands, letting my arms shake just enough to sell it. "Let's go, sweetheart," I said gently. We walked out of the apartment and rode the elevator down. Celia stood watching the floor numbers count down, not breathing. I rested a hand on her shoulder, but my mind was somewhere else entirely, mapping exits, reading sightlines, calculating the distance to the truck. The elevator chimed, and the doors opened onto the ground floor lobby. And there he was. Grant Kellner was planted directly in our path, gripping a leather portfolio bag, dressed in a custom-tailored suit that probably cost more than my truck had when it was new. He was 35, entitled, and moved with the effortless arrogance of a man who had always purchased his way out of accountability. His gaze dropped to Celia's bag, and whatever smugness had been on his face curdled into something uglier. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his voice loaded with condescension. Celia went rigid. She stepped behind me on instinct, using my body as a wall. Grant let out a short, contemptuous laugh. He walked toward us slowly, his expensive shoes snapping against the marble with each step. He pulled up a few feet away and looked me over with undisguised disgust. He didn't register a threat. He saw an old man in a denim work shirt clutching a cheap duffel bag. Grant stepped past me and seized Celia's arm with a hard grip. "You're not going anywhere," he snapped, wrenching her toward him. She tried to pull free, but he yanked her back. I moved forward, keeping my hands deliberately unsteady as I laid my fingers lightly on his wrist. "Please, son," I said, letting my voice crack just right, the sound of a frightened old man at the end of his nerve. "Let her go. We don't want any trouble." Grant threw my hand off hard enough that I stumbled back a step. "You don't want trouble, old man," he sneered. "You're standing in my lobby trying to walk off with my girlfriend. If she goes through those doors, I will freeze every cent she has. I'll drown you both in legal fees until you're forced to sell that junk heap of a truck and sleep on a park bench." He swung back to Celia. Get upstairs, now. I kept my chin down, eyes on the marble floor, shoulders caved in. I gave a small, submissive nod, the pictures of a man defeated by money and muscle. "I'm sorry, son," I mumbled. "Just let her collect her things. We'll get out of your way." Grant smiled then, a slow, sickening smile, the smile of a man who believed he had just won. He released Celia's arm, convinced he'd established the natural order. Dominant man, cowed old father, frightened girlfriend. The moment he turned to bark something at the valet, I quietly steered Celia through the revolving doors and into the passenger seat of the truck. I threw the bag into the bed, got behind the wheel, and pulled out. Grant was shouting from the lobby entrance, but we were already gone. As we worked through the Charlotte, North Carolina traffic, Celia finally came apart. She pressed her face into her hands and sobbed. "Dad, I'm so sorry," she choked out. "He froze our joint accounts this morning. He kept my car keys. He said if I left, he'd destroy everything I had. I have nothing. Nothing left." I let her cry. I kept my eyes forward, moving smoothly with the flow of afternoon traffic. No yelling, no cursing Grant's name. I was assessing. I checked the rearview mirror. A black pickup truck with heavily tinted windows had rolled out of a parking garage 2 blocks back and was holding my exact speed. I changed lanes. It changed lanes. I eased off for a yellow light. It eased off with me. Grant had put a tail on us. Celia was still crying, laying out the financial abuse she'd endured over the past 6 months. I absorbed enough to understand the shape of it, but the other half of my attention was doing what it had done for 30 years. I was tracking the predator behind me. Without tipping her off, I made a sharp right down a narrow industrial side street. The black pickup took the turn too, but dropped back, trying to stay casual. I didn't accelerate. Accelerating tells them, you know. Instead, I held a perfectly ordinary pace, working through a maze of back roads, delivery alleys, and tight residential blocks, muscle memory from decades of field work, using blind corners and timed traffic signals like instruments. I cut left through a busy strip mall lot, let a delivery truck seal off the main exit behind me, and slipped out through the rear service road. Inside of 10 minutes, the black pickup had vanished, swallowed by the suburban grid. Celia never suspected a thing. We left the city behind and drove toward the heavily wooded property Lorraine and I owned in the Blue Ridge foothills of western North Carolina. The moment concrete gave way to tall pines, something in me eased. We came up the long gravel drive and stopped near the house. Lorraine was already on the porch. She didn't need an explanation. One look at Celia's tear-streaked face was enough. She came down the steps and pulled our daughter into her arms. My wife doesn't miss much. She built her career as a federal prosecutor, and she knows exactly how to meet a crisis. Lorraine guided Celia gently inside, leaving me alone in the quiet of the porch. I was about to follow when Celia's phone buzzed from inside the battered nylon duffel bag I was still holding. I unzipped it, fished out the phone, and read the screen. Grant. I swiped to answer and put it to my ear without making a sound. "You think you're clever, old man." Grant's voice came through hot with arrogance. "You think you can just drive away and stash her somewhere? I know where you live. I know exactly where that little cabin in the woods is. Send her back right now, or I'll dispatch my guys to your property to drag her out themselves. And if you get in the way, I'll make sure you spend your retirement years eating out of dumpsters." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue or engage. I simply breathed slow and steady and let him run himself out. When he finally stopped assuming my silence was fear, I pressed the end button and slipped the phone into my pocket. I stood there looking out at the tree line ringing my property as the last light dropped away. Night came fast in the woods. Lorraine had cooked a warm dinner and gotten Celia settled into the guest room. The house went quiet, but my instincts had no interest in resting. Around midnight, I was in the dark living room, still in my chair watching the front window. The silence broke gravel crunching at the far end of the long driveway. No headlights, but the moonlight found the outline of the same black pickup truck from that afternoon, idling at the tree line like a held threat. A moment later, the passenger door opened. A man stepped out and started up the driveway toward the house. I stayed perfectly still in the dark, watching every step he took. He stopped on the lawn, drew his arm back, and hurled something hard. The rock punched through the living room window, spraying glass across the wooden floor. The man wheeled around and trotted back to the pickup, and it disappeared into the dark. I didn't flinch at the sound of breaking glass. I got up, calmly crossed to the shattered window, and retrieved the heavy stone from the floorboards. Wrapped tight around it with duct tape was a folded square of white paper. I peeled the tape free and opened the note in the thin moonlight. The words were scrawled in thick black marker. Send her back or the house burns. I held those words in my gaze for a long moment. Then I folded the paper with care and put it in my pocket. Grant Kellner thought he was putting fear into a helpless old man. He thought this was a game he'd already finished winning. He had no idea he'd just stepped into the sights of someone who had spent a career hunting men far more dangerous than he would ever be. I stood on the porch, the crunch of shattered glass under my boots, the stone and its crude threat a dead weight in my pocket. Send her back or the house burns. I looked out at the dark wall of trees encircling my home. To most people, that darkness would look like nothing, but I knew better. I understood exactly what men like Grant Kellner were built from, that particular brand of arrogance that convinces them they can do whatever they want without consequence. He believed he was dealing with a frightened old man. He thought the cards were all in his hands. He had no idea what he had just woken up. I didn't reach for the phone to call the police. That was the first rule from the life I'd walked away from. When the threat is real and your family is the target, you don't wait on a dispatcher. You handle it yourself. I went back inside, checked that Celia was still asleep. She was worn down to nothing, curled up in the guest room, finally finding some fragile peace after the terror of the afternoon. Lorraine met me in the hallway, her face giving nothings away. She took in the broken window, the paper in my hand. She asked nothing. She didn't waver. She just looked at me with an expression that said everything it needed to. Do what you have to do. I went out the back door and walked through the damp grass toward the barn. The night air was sharp and clean, pine and wet earth familiar enough to steady me. The barn was my retreat, packed with tools and old recollections. But it held other things beneath the surface, things I hadn't laid hands on in years. I pushed aside a heavy wooden workbench, my shoulder protesting, with a deep familiar ache, the kind earned over decades in the shadows, and behind it sat a solid steel safe. I worked the combination, the measured clicks of the dial settling something in me. The door swung open. Inside, resting on a square of dark velvet, was my badge, United States Marshal. It wasn't just a piece of stamped metal. It stood for 30 years of running down the most dangerous men alive, men who believed no one could touch them, men cut from the same cloth as Grant Kellner. Next to the badge sat the gear, the tactical vest, the communications equipment, the surveillance hardware that had tracked fugitives across borders and continents. I had not touched any of it since I put in my papers, hoping that part of my life had sealed itself permanently shut. But some things don't stay sealed. I lifted out the small, unremarkable black units. These were nothing like off-the-shelf security cameras. They were military-grade, designed to be completely invisible, capable of pulling high-resolution images and video in total darkness. I spent the next 3 hours methodically working my way around the perimeter of the property. I moved with the quiet economy of someone who had spent a lifetime staying one step ahead of an enemy. Each camera went in with purpose, covering every approach, every dead angle, every gap in the sightlines. I tucked them into the hollows of old oaks and buried them inside the dense underbrush lenses trained on the driveway, the woodline, and the main road. As I worked, everything came flooding back. The razor focus, the cold, measured thinking that had kept me breathing through places that should have killed me. I was no longer Dale Pruitt, the retired grandfather. I was the operative who had dismantled cartels, had tracked phantoms through the most hostile terrain on Earth. And my current target was a pampered, arrogant real estate developer who had made the grave error of threatening my daughter. I wrapped up the installation as the first gray light began bleeding into the horizon. I stood at the property's edge, looking out over the trees. The trap was set. The perimeter was locked. Grant Kellner believed he was the one doing the hunting. He thought intimidation and money were enough to get him, whatever he reached for. But he had just walked into a cage built by someone who knew exactly how to construct one, and the door was about to close. I went back to the house, the cool morning air pressing against the heat of something rekindled in me. Lorraine was up filling a heavy enamel mug with coffee. She looked at me, concern in her eyes, but something steadier underneath it. "Perimeter's secure," I said, quietly accepting the mug. She nodded once the weight of those words fully understood. The terms of the fight had shifted. Grant Kellner was no longer dealing with a frightened old man. He was dealing with a phantom, a ghost, from a world he had no framework to understand. And as I drank my coffee and watched the sun inch up over the trees, I knew with total certainty that he was going to regret the day he ever put his hands on my daughter. The quiet pivot was complete. The hunt was on. The morning sun had barely cleared the tall pine trees around our property when a heavy fist hammered the front door. Celia startled, sloshing hot coffee across the kitchen table. The terror in her eyes was immediate. Lorraine laid a calm, steady hand over our daughter's shaking fingers while I moved toward the entryway. I didn't stop to check the perimeter cameras. I already knew what I'd find. Arrogant men who lean on their wealth are utterly predictable when raw intimidation falls short. They pick up the law like a weapon. I opened the door to a young county deputy standing on my porch, visibly ill at ease, shifting his weight back and forth, gripping a thick stack of manila folders. He asked for Celia Pruitt. I nodded, stepped back, and called my daughter over. When he pressed the heavy stack into her hands and told her she'd been served, every trace of color left her face. She took the folders with trembling hands, backing away, as the deputy turned and walked to his cruiser without another word. Celia carried the stack to the kitchen table. She opened the first folder, and her eyes moved fast across the dense legal language. Within moments, her breathing went shallow. A quiet, broken sob left her before she dropped the papers to the floor like they'd burned her. She sank into a chair and folded her arms around herself. "Dad," she whispered, her voice so fractured I could barely make it out. "He's suing me. He's saying I stole from his company." I gathered the documents from the floor and read through the opening pages. Grant Kellner was formally accusing my daughter of embezzling $75,000 from his luxury real estate development firm. The paperwork was meticulous, fabricated ledger entries, doctored bank statements, layered legal threats demanding immediate repayment and warning of criminal charges. It had been signed off by a local civil judge named Judge Holcomb. I knew that name. Judge Holcomb had a well-worn reputation in the county for his warm relationship with wealthy developers who quietly bankrolled his re-election. Grant hadn't just retained an aggressive lawyer, he had effectively purchased a judge. "He's going to send me to prison," Celia sobbed, pressing her face into her hands. She was hyperventilating, the sheer magnitude of it crushing her. "He told me he would do this. He said he'd make it look like I was the one moving money through his accounts. I never touched a single cent of his company funds. I swear to you I didn't. But he has all of these official documents. He has the judge. They're going to destroy my life." Lorraine crossed the room and pulled our daughter close, holding her, and murmuring softly, smoothing her hair. I stood completely still. No empty reassurances, no frantic words. I just stared at the ink on the page. Grant thought he had played the decisive hand. He thought he had backed us into a corner so dark that surrender was the only exit. Right on cue, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and read the bright screen. It was a text from an unknown number, but I had no doubt who sent it. The message read, "I told you I would ruin her, old man. Send her back to me right now, and the lawsuit disappears. Keep playing games, and she will spend the next 10 years in a tiny federal cell." I held my gaze on that screen for a long moment. A normal father would have come apart. A normal father would have been on the phone with the local police, or worse, weighing whether to give the man what he wanted just to spare his daughter from prison. But I was not a normal father. I had spent 30 years dismantling international criminal enterprises. I had sat across cold metal tables from cartel bosses who made Grant Kellner look like a toddler throwing a fit in a sandbox. I pocketed the phone and moved to the kitchen table. I pulled out a chair and settled directly across from my trembling daughter. I reached over and covered her hands with mine, gently drawing them away from her tear-soaked face. "Celia," I said, my voice low, calm, and without a trace of uncertainty. "Look at me right now." She blinked hard, trying to push through the tears, her chest still heaving. Her eyes found mine, and I made certain what she saw. There was nothing but cold, absolute certainty. "You are not going to prison," I told her. "You are not stepping foot in a courtroom. You are not paying this man a single dime, and you are most certainly never going back to him." "But the papers," she sobbed, gesturing weakly toward the heavy stack of folders on the table. "He has the judge. He has all the money in the world. He has everything." I picked up the legal documents and felt the weight of them. To a terrified civilian, this looked like a death warrant. To a man who understood how the justice system truly functioned, it was just a pile of cheap paper, and paper burns. "Grant thinks he's waging war with money and lawsuits," I said, keeping my voice level. "He thinks buying a local judge means he controls the whole board. But what Grant doesn't understand is that when you fabricate financial crimes to frame an innocent person, you leave a paper trail. You leave digital fingerprints. He thinks the law is an impenetrable shield. He just handed us the exact weapon we need to take his entire life apart. Celia stared at me, the raw panic in her face beginning to loosen into something closer to confusion. "Dad, what are you talking about?" she asked, wiping at her cheek. "How do we fight a millionaire who has a corrupt judge in his pocket? We don't even have the money to hire someone to read this mess." I gave her the faintest reassuring smile. I released her hands, got to my feet, and picked the fraudulent lawsuit up off the table. Lorraine, who had devoted her career to prosecuting people exactly like Grant Kellner, caught my eye from across the room. She gave me one slow, knowing nod. She had already spotted the fatal flaw buried in his arrogant play. When you submit falsified financial records to a court, you are committing perjury and fraud at the federal level. Grant Kellner had just documented his own crimes and delivered them to a retired United States Marshal. "Don't worry about the paperwork, sweetheart," I said, turning toward the hallway. "I know people who tear this kind of thing apart before breakfast. You stay here with your mother, drink your coffee, try to rest. I have a very important call to make." As I walked down the quiet hallway, the familiar cold focus settled back into my bones like it had never left. Grant Kellner had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. By formally accusing my daughter of financial crimes, he had unwittingly cracked the door open for a full federal inquiry into his own real estate operation. He thought he was running a simple small-town intimidation play. He had no idea I was about to drag him into a federal arena, where his money and his purchased judge would count for absolutely nothing. He wanted to weaponize the law against my family. I was going to use his own towering arrogance to make sure he never saw the outside of a maximum security cell again. I went to the small study at the back of the house and pulled the heavy oak door shut behind me. The room held the scent of old paper and leather, a quiet place where I kept what remained of a former life. I moved to the bottom drawer of my desk, past the ordinary files, and found the false panel. Beneath it lay a heavy encrypted satellite phone. I hadn't powered it on in 4 years, but the battery life on these government-issued units was the stuff of legend. I pressed the button and watched the small green screen come alive. It was time to call in a ghost. Clifford Haywood was now a senior partner at one of the most ruthless corporate law firms in Atlanta, Georgia. He billed by the minute and wore suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent. But 20 years ago, Clifford was a terrified rookie federal prosecutor assigned to a cartel task force. He had made a careless mistake on a wiretap operation and accidentally exposed himself to a syndicate hit squad. They sent 3 men to his apartment in the middle of the night. I was the operative the marshals dispatched to intercept them. I sat in the dark of Clifford's living room while he stayed hidden in a closet. When the front door splintered inward, I made sure those 3 men never took another step forward. Clifford owed me his life, and he knew it. He had told me to call whenever I needed anything, no matter what it cost. Today, I was collecting. I dialed the secure sequence and waited. 2 rings, then a sharp professional voice. "Clifford Haywood speaking." "Clifford," I said, keeping my voice low and even. "It's Dale Pruitt." A silence stretched out on the other end. I caught the faint sound of Atlanta, Georgia traffic bleeding through the receiver, followed by the soft click of a door being closed. When Clifford spoke again, the corporate Polish was completely gone, replaced by the straightforward respect of a man who knew exactly who he was talking to. "Dale," he said, exhaling slowly. "It has been a long time. Is everything all right? Are you and Lorraine safe?" "We're safe," I said. "But my daughter Celia has a problem. A local real estate developer named Grant Kellner just served her with a fabricated lawsuit accusing her of embezzling $75,000 from his company. He bought a local judge to rubber stamp the paperwork. He is trying to terrify her into coming back to him. Tell me you have a copy of the filing." Clifford said, his voice hardening with the protective instinct of an old friend. "Fax it to my secure line. I'll have a team of litigators rip it apart before lunch. We'll countersue for malicious prosecution and pile injunctions on him until he can't draw a breath." "No," I said, settling back in my chair. "We are not going to fight the lawsuit, Clifford. The lawsuit is a distraction, a loud noise designed to make us panic and scramble for a defense. If we take him on in a local civil court, we're playing by his rules on his home ground. I don't play defense. We go straight for the throat." I heard Clifford shift in his seat. "What do you need me to do, Dale?" "Pull every corporate record, every tax filing, and every public ledger connected to Grant Kellner and his development company," I told him. "I want to see exactly how his money moves, I want to know who his partners are, who supplies his materials, and where his capital comes from. I want his financial life taken apart down to the last penny. Consider it done, Clifford replied, already typing. But if this man is a local heavyweight, he's probably running shell companies to bury his real assets. Public records will only give us the surface. We need a way to look behind the curtain. I'm handling that right now, I told him. You gather the public data and cross-reference it against his known assets. I'll get the shadow files. We convene in exactly 3 hours. I ended the call and set the phone on the desk. Clifford was right. Public records were theater built to satisfy the IRS and local tax boards, nothing more. To truly understand a man like Grant Kellner, I needed to see the money he was working hard to keep invisible. I needed a forensic accountant with federal clearance. I picked the satellite phone back up and dialed a different number. This one connected to a secure line inside the Treasury Department. The man who answered was an old task force analyst named Roland. He had spent his entire career running phantom funds to ground for the government. "Dale Pruitt, you old hunting dog!" Roland laughed through the receiver. "I figured you were out on a porch somewhere, whittling sticks." "I'm taking a break from the porch, Roland," I said, holding my tone steady. "I need a shadow check on a mid-level real estate developer operating in the Blue Ridge foothills of western North Carolina. Name is Grant Kellner." Roland stopped laughing immediately. The sound of rapid typing replaced his easy humor. "Give me a second, Dale. You know I'm not supposed to run off-book inquiries without a federal warrant." "I know," I replied smoothly, "but I also know you still owe me for pulling your brother out of that witness protection disaster in New Orleans, Louisiana." "Fair enough," Roland muttered. "Give me the target's name again." I spelled out Grant's full name and the registered title of his primary development company. I listened as Roland worked his way through databases that didn't officially exist, the surveillance networks the government used to track terrorism funding and international smuggling operations. Turning that kind of firepower on a local, arrogant developer was like using a sniper rifle to swat a mosquito. But Grant had brought this on himself. "Dale," Roland said, his voice dropping to a serious murmur, "I'm looking at the preliminary routing numbers on his corporate accounts. Something is deeply wrong here." "Define wrong," I said, tightening my grip on the edge of the desk. "He runs a luxury housing development firm." "Right," Roland said. "But his capital isn't coming from domestic loans or standard real estate investors. He's receiving massive wire transfers from offshore accounts routed through the Cayman Islands and Cyprus. They're breaking the deposits into smaller increments to dodge automatic flagging, but the volume is staggering. We're talking millions of dollars pouring into his company for properties that haven't broken ground yet. He's washing cash." I said, the realization clicking perfectly into place. "He's running a money laundering machine," Roland confirmed. "The money flows in from overseas. He registers it as anonymous foreign investment capital for his building projects. Then it gets filtered into clean domestic assets. Dale, this isn't a local hustle. The routing numbers on these offshore accounts flag back to an Eastern European syndicate the FBI has been trying to nail for 5 years. Your boy Grant is a glorified middleman, moving dirty money for some very dangerous people." A cold smile crossed my face. Grant thought he was a king because he had a custom-tailored suit and a purchased judge. But he was nothing more than a highly expendable pawn for an international cartel. He didn't own his empire. He was just minding the keys for monsters he had no chance of controlling. "Roland," I said, my voice dropping to a flat, lethal calm. "Keep tracking those routing numbers. Don't flag them officially yet. Just collect the data." "You got it, Dale," Roland replied. "But watch yourself with this one. If he's holding the bag for a syndicate, he's running scared. Desperate men like that will do whatever it takes to keep the money moving." I ended the call and sat looking out the study window into the thick woods. Grant was desperate. That explained why he had come apart when Celia walked out. That was why he was weaponizing a fabricated lawsuit to terrorize her. She wasn't just his girlfriend. She was a liability. He had almost certainly attached her name to some of those fraudulent accounts without her knowing it, positioning her as the perfect fall guy if his operation ever unraveled. If she disappeared from his reach, she could inadvertently expose his entire money laundering pipeline. Grant thought he was running down a frightened girl and her frail old father. He had absolutely no idea I had just mapped the entire skeleton of his criminal life. He wanted to play a game of ruin. He was about to learn what real ruin looked like. Exactly 3 hours later, the encrypted satellite phone vibrated against the polished wood of my desk. I picked it up and pressed the green button. Clifford skipped the pleasantries entirely. He went straight into the financial autopsy of Grant Kellner. "Dale, you were right," Clifford said, his voice tight with something close to disbelief. "Public records show a highly successful luxury real estate developer. But when my team drilled into the subsidiary filings and cross-referenced them with corporate tax returns, the whole picture fell apart. Grant's domestic company is hemorrhaging cash. His high-end apartment buildings are essentially vacant. He hasn't sold a legitimate unit in over 2 years. The man is completely bankrupt on paper." I listened carefully, letting the data settle. "But the company is still running," I said. "He lives in a penthouse. He drives expensive cars. How is he staying afloat?" "Through a network of heavily layered shell companies," Clifford explained. "He has 3 primary holding entities registered in Delaware. Those entities are receiving enormous continuous cash injections from overseas, classified as anonymous foreign investment capital for future development projects. But the money sits for a few days and then gets transferred out to various domestic accounts under the cover of contractor payments and material costs. He's washing dirty money, Dale, washing millions. I already had the overseas money from Roland. What Clifford had were the corporate blueprints. But I needed to understand why Grant was so desperate to drag Celia back into this." "Clifford," I said, leaning in, "Grant is doing everything he can to get Celia back. He's using a fabricated lawsuit to terrorize her. Why, if he's running a massive laundering operation, the last thing he'd want is to draw attention to himself through a local civil suit. Why is she so critical to him?" I heard papers shuffling on Clifford's end. He exhaled slowly and heavily. "Because she's the fall guy, Dale." I pulled the incorporation documents for the primary holding company in Delaware, the one receiving the largest offshore deposits. Grant is not listed as the chief executive officer. Celia is. A cold knot formed in my stomach. "Explain that," I said, barely above a whisper. "He either forged her signature or buried the incorporation paperwork inside a stack of routined documents and tricked her into signing," Clifford said. "Legally speaking, she is the primary beneficiary and the chief officer of the shell company holding the laundered money. If the IRS or federal government ever audits that company, Grant walks away clean. Celia goes to federal prison for decades." The sheer calculated malice of Grant's scheme came into sharp focus. He hadn't just manipulated my daughter emotionally, he had methodically transformed her into a human shield for a violent criminal syndicate. "The lawsuit," Clifford continued, his voice quickening, "it's not purely about frightening her. It's a trap. He's accusing her of embezzling $75,000. If she panics and tries to settle out of court, she'll have to sign a settlement agreement, one that places her officially on the legal record acknowledging her connection to his corporate accounts. It locks her to the shell company permanently. But if she fights it in court, discovery opens up his books. The authorities see the offshore money, and the syndicate realizes Grant exposed their laundering pipeline to a local courtroom." I finished the thought. "Exactly," Clifford said. "Grant is cornered. If Celia talks to a lawyer or goes to the police, the syndicate will understand their money is at risk. And men who launder millions don't retain lawyers when their money is in danger. They send killers. Grant knows his bosses will have him executed if this goes public. He needs Celia back under his complete control to keep the shell company intact and the syndicate blind to his mistakes." "He's a dead man walking," I said quietly, "and he's trying to pull my daughter into the grave with him." "Dale," Clifford said, his voice lowering with real concern, "this is no longer a domestic dispute or a crooked civil suit. You are dealing with cartel money. If Grant panics and tells his handlers that Celia is a security risk, they won't just send local muscle to your house. They'll send professionals. You need to get Celia out of the state. You need to put her in protective custody right now." I looked out the study window at the dark, still woods encircling my property. I thought about the 30 years I had spent hunting men, exactly like Grant's bosses. I thought about the trail cameras freshly mounted around my perimeter, and the shotgun locked in the cabinet. Running was not an option. Running meant spending the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders. When wolves are tracking you, you don't flee into open ground. You lure them into a cage. "We're not running Clifford," I said. "If we run, Grant controls the story. He'll activate his corrupt judge, get a warrant issued for her arrest, and use the local police to hunt her down for him. We are staying right here." "Then what's your play, Dale?" Clifford asked. "I'm going to bleed him," I replied. Grant is running on arrogance and fear. He believes he can bully us into surrender before his syndicate bosses notice his mistakes. We are going to expose those mistakes. I want you to draw up a formal federal audit notification. Use every intimidating legal mechanism you can locate. I want you to legally freeze the assets in that Delaware shell company before the day is out. Dale, if I freeze that account, the offshore deposits will bounce back, Clifford warned. The syndicate will know immediately that something is off. They will start demanding answers from Grant. That is precisely what I want, I told him. I want Grant to feel the noose drawing tight around his throat. I want him to understand that his money has vanished. His power is a fiction, and his bosses are coming. When a predator is starved and backed into a corner, he gets careless. He stops calculating and starts reacting on instinct. I want him rattled. I want him walking through my door. I ended the call before Clifford had a chance to push back. I sat in the still of the study, letting the full weight of where things stood settle over me. My daughter was not simply dealing with a violent ex-boyfriend. She was tied to an international criminal enterprise. Grant Kellner believed he had constructed the perfect crime. He thought a frail old man and a frightened woman were all he needed to keep his empire safe. He was about to receive a very hard education in the kind of men who actually work in the shadows. I rose from the desk and walked out of the study. It was time to begin pulling Grant's life apart one piece at a time. We needed basic household supplies to maintain the appearance of a normal routine. Lorraine was putting together a list of dry goods in the kitchen, and I offered to take Celia to the small local grocery store a few miles down the road from our property. It was a calculated risk, but my daughter needed air and movement, some thin shred of normalcy after the terror of that morning. I drove the rusted 1996 Chevy pickup, my eyes working the mirrors in a constant sweep. No black pickup truck with heavily tinted windows fell in behind us. Grant was either sharpening his approach or growing desperate enough to shift his tactics. The grocery store was quiet, a drowsy little rural market with flickering fluorescent lights and cramped aisles. The air carried the smell of old floor wax and fresh citrus. Celia picked up a green plastic basket and moved at a slow pace toward the produce section. Her shoulders stayed rigid, her gaze snapping toward the automatic sliding doors every time they hissed apart. I kept a few paces back, giving her room, while never letting her drift from my line of sight. I slipped away for just a moment to grab a bag of coffee beans one aisle over. It was a brief, deliberate separation, a tactical opening I offered, so Grant would feel bold enough to move if he had eyes on us. I caught the sharp intake of breath before I even came around the corner. I eased quietly to the edge of aisle 4 and looked down the narrow corridor. Grant Kellner had ambushed my daughter. He had slipped into the store without drawing notice, and now he stood far too close to her, completely cutting off her path to the main checkout lanes. He wore a heavy designer wool coat that looked grotesquely out of place in a dusty little market like this. His face was twisted into a mask of ugly desperation and fury. "You think you can just go silent on my calls?" he hissed, pressing directly into her space. "You think you can hide out in the woods with your pitiful parents, and I am just going to let this lawsuit drop?" Celia retreated until her shoulders pressed against the canned goods shelf. She looked absolutely terrified, clutching the green plastic basket to her chest, like it was the only shield she had. "I told you I am done, Grant." She stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, just leave me alone." Grant drove his hand into the metal shelving right beside her head. A few cans rattled loose and hit the cold linoleum floor, rolling off toward the center of the aisle. "You do not get to tell me when we are done," he snarled, his voice vibrating with barely leashed violence. "You are coming back to the city with me right now. You are going to sign the settlement papers for the embezzlement lawsuit, and you are going to do exactly what I say. If you refuse, I promise you, I will burn your parents' retirement to the ground. I will take their house and leave them rotting on the street." I drew a slow breath and let my posture completely give way. I came around the corner, with my shoulders hunched and my hands shaking visibly. I deliberately knocked a box of cereal off a display stand, making a loud blundering noise to signal my arrival. Grant's head swiveled sharply, his eyes fixing on me with pure contempt. "Please, son," I said, my voice thin and trembling. I stepped forward with both hands raised in a gesture of complete submission. "Please do not hurt my daughter. We are not looking for trouble. Just let her walk out of here. We will stay out of your way. I promise." Grant let out a short, ugly laugh. He stepped back from Celia and moved slowly in my direction. The arrogance pouring off him was almost suffocating. He took in my faded denim work shirt, my bent posture, my worn-out work boots. "You are a pathetic old man," he said, shaking his head. "I told you to send her back, and you thought you could play games with me. Now you are both going to pay for that." I took another shuffling step forward, placing myself deliberately between him and my terrified daughter. I reached out a trembling hand and lightly touched the deep pocket of his heavy designer coat. "Please," I begged, letting real tears gather at the corners of my eyes. "I will do whatever you want. I will give you my truck. I will give you my life savings. Just please do not take my little girl." Grant's face twisted with absolute contempt as he sneered down at me. He stared at my shaking hand resting against his expensive wool coat. "Don't touch me, you piece of trash," he snapped. He raised his arm and shoved me hard in the chest. I let my body go completely limp. I offered no resistance, made no attempt to catch my balance. The full force of his push sent me backward, landing hard on the cold linoleum floor. The impact rang out down the empty aisle. My elbow absorbed the worst of the fall, sending a real jolt of pain shooting up my arm. I pushed it aside. I lay still on the floor, groaning faintly and clutching my chest as though every bit of air had been driven out of me. "Dad!" Celia screamed, dropping her basket and rushing to my side. She fell to her knees next to me and wrapped her arms around my shoulders. She looked up at Grant with hatred cutting through her terror. "You are a monster," she cried. Grant stood over me, staring down at my figure sprawled across the dirty grocery store floor. He let out a loud, rolling laugh that carried through the quiet market. "Look at your great protector, Celia," he taunted, gesturing down at me with a careless wave. "This weak, useless old fool can't even stay on his feet. You think he is going to save you from me? You think he can stop what is already coming? You are both nothing but dead weight." I let out another soft groan, pressing my eyes shut as though the pain was overwhelming. Celia was sobbing, pleading with me to get up, but I held perfectly still on the floor, playing the role of the beaten, helpless old man with complete commitment. Grant straightened the lapels of his heavy coat, every inch the king surveying his court. He had asserted himself physically and mentally. He had shown Celia that her father was nothing more than a fragile obstacle easily brushed aside by his money and his reach. "You have until tonight to pack your things and come back to the city," Grant said, his voice soaked in venom. "If I don't hear from you by midnight, I am activating the judge. I am freezing your parents' accounts, and then I am coming back to that cabin to finish this. Do not make me come back to the woods, Celia." With one final look of disgust aimed at me trembling on the floor, Grant turned on his heel and strode confidently out of the aisle. We listened to his heavy footsteps echo toward the front doors and dissolve into the parking lot. Celia was still crying, gripping my shirt, asking me over and over to tell her I was all right. I slowly opened my eyes and looked up at my daughter. The trembling in my hands stopped instantly. Every trace of fear drained from my face, replaced by the cold, steady focus of a man who was simply doing his job. I pushed myself upright and brushed the dust from my denim work shirt. I was completely fine. Grant believed he had just won the war, but what he could not see was that his arrogance had handed me the precise weapon I needed to take him apart. I lay on the cold linoleum floor of that grocery aisle and let out one long, unsteady breath. My elbows burned from the impact and my shoulder ached, but my mind was locked in with absolute clarity. Grant Kellner stood over me, his expensive leather shoes barely an inch from my face. He was laughing, a cruel, hollow sound that moved through the quiet market like a bad smell. He was certain he had broken me. He was certain he had demonstrated to Celia that her father was nothing more than a frail, useless old man. He was riding a wave of pure, arrogant triumph, and that was exactly the condition I needed him in. When a predator is convinced he has already won, his attention starts to wander. He grows careless. Grant was so absorbed in grinding me down, so drunk on his own ego, that he never noticed my right hand drifting slowly toward the heavy wool fabric of his custom-tailored overcoat. "Please," I whimpered, letting my voice fracture with carefully crafted fear. "I am sorry. Just leave her alone." I shifted my weight on the floor, making a show of struggling to push myself up. As I moved, I let my right arm brush clumsily against the deep side pocket of his coat. To anyone watching it was a disorganized, helpless flail, but to a man who had spent 3 decades placing surveillance devices on international fugitives, it was a flawlessly executed sleight of hand. Pinched between my fingers were 2 pieces of federal-grade technology, The first was a GPS tracking beacon no bigger than a dime, invisible to any commercial sweep. The second was a microscopic audio transmitter built for deep cover counterterrorism work. In one smooth motion dressed up as a desperate grab at his coat for balance, I slipped both devices deep into the lining of his pocket. "Don't touch me, you piece of trash," Grant barked, stepping back and knocking my arm away. I let my hand drop to the floor and pulled myself into a fetal curl, as if his sudden movement had genuinely frightened me. It was done. The payload was delivered. Grant Kellner was now walking around with a federal listening post, sitting comfortably in his coat. Every move he made, every conversation he had, every frantic call to his syndicate bosses, I would hear every word. Grant straightened his lapels, his face settling into a mask of undisguised contempt. "I will give you until tonight to pack your bags and come back to the city," he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing hiss aimed squarely at Celia. "If I do not hear from you by midnight, I am activating the judge. I am freezing your parents' bank accounts, and then I am coming back to that cabin to finish this. Do not make me come back to the woods, Celia." He turned on his heel and walked with confidence out of the aisle, his heavy footsteps fading toward the automatic front doors. Celia dropped to her knees beside me, her face drained of color and streaked with fresh tears. She wrapped both arms around my shoulders, trying to help me sit up. "Dad," she sobbed, her voice shaking badly. "Oh my God, Dad, are you okay? I am so sorry. I am so sorry." I waited until I heard the distant chime of the grocery store doors sliding open and shut. I waited until I knew Grant was crossing the parking lot, completely blind to the fact that he had just placed the keys to his entire criminal empire directly into my hands. Then the trembling in my hands ceased. The frightened hunch left my shoulders. I pushed myself upright and brushed the dust from my denim work shirt. I looked at my daughter, and the terrified old man she had just witnessed was gone. My face hardened into the cold, deliberate focus of a U.S. Marshal. "I am fine, sweetheart," I said, my voice low level and completely steady. Celia went, still staring at me in disbelief. Her tears slowed, giving way to pure bewilderment. "But he shoved you," she stammered. "You hit that floor so hard." "I let him shove me," I told her, keeping my tone perfectly even. "I needed him close. I needed him to feel untouchable. When a man like Grant feels powerful, he stops scanning for the trap." "Trap," Celia repeated, dragging a tear from her cheek. "Dad, what did you do?" I got to my feet and offered her my hand. She took it, and I brought her gently upright. I collected her fallen green plastic basket from the floor and handed it back to her. "I just put a collar on him," I said quietly. "He thinks he's walking out of here to ruin our lives. He has no idea he is stepping directly into a federal monitoring net. Every move he makes from here on out, every word out of his mouth, I am going to know about it. We are going to let him drive back to the city. We are going to let him feel like he has won. And then we are going to burn his entire world down." I steered a still-stunned Celia toward the checkout lanes, paid for our few items with cash, and walked her out to the rusted 1996 Chevy pickup in silence. As I turned the engine over and eased onto the quiet rural road, I felt the old familiar cold rhythm of a hunt settle in around me. Grant Kellner had just crossed a line he could not walk back from. He had threatened my family. He had put his hands on me. He believed he was running a game of intimidation. He had no idea the board had flipped and that he was now simply a blip on a radar screen. I drove Celia back to the property in total silence, letting the steady hum of the old truck settle her frayed nerves. Lorraine met us at the front door. She asked nothing about the grocery store or the dried tear tracks on our daughter's face. She simply folded Celia into her arms and walked her toward the warmth of the kitchen. I went straight down the hall to my study and locked the heavy oak door behind me. Time to work. I powered up the encrypted receiver I had pulled from the steel safe earlier that morning. The digital frequency found the tracking beacon almost immediately. I pulled the heavy black headphones over my ears, closed my eyes, and let everything else fall away. The audio feed from the microscopic bug I had tucked into the deep pocket of Grant's coat was startlingly clear. I could hear the deep roar of his luxury car engine and the sound of his own rapid, ragged breathing. Grant was driving far too fast. I listened as he jabbed a button on his dashboard to dial a number. The line rang twice before a cold, clipped voice picked up. The man on the other end carried a thick Eastern European accent, and his tone held not a trace of warmth. Grant sounded like a completely different person now. The towering, arrogant bully who had cornered my daughter in a grocery aisle had evaporated entirely. What remained was a terrified, desperate middleman scrambling to protect himself. Grant stumbled through an attempt to explain the sudden delay in the real estate transfers. He told his offshore handler that the domestic holding accounts had hit a temporary snag. He tried to lay the blame at Celia's feet. He told the man on the phone that his girlfriend had disappeared and might be looking to complicate the corporate structure as a form of extortion. The voice on the phone had no patience for excuses. The handler stated with cold precision that $5 million was parked in the Delaware holding account, waiting to be laundered through domestic contractors. Grant had exactly 48 hours to move the funds. If the money didn't clear by then, they would dispatch a cleanup crew to deal with Grant permanently. The line went dead. I sat and listened to Grant hammering his fist against the steering wheel, screaming in raw, unfiltered panic. I had everything I needed. I had a clean digital recording of Grant acknowledging that he was holding syndicate money and speaking directly with his offshore handlers. I pulled the audio file from the receiver and packaged it together with the offshore routing numbers my contact Roland had gathered for me earlier in the day. I opened a classified communication portal on my satellite phone and sent the entire encrypted package directly to my old federal task force commander in Washington. I attached a brief message directing them to follow the money and prepare for a major asset seizure. Then, I picked up the phone and called Clifford Haywood. I told him I had the smoking gun and that the syndicate had given Grant a 48-hour window to move the cash. I told Clifford it was time to drop the hammer. Clifford did not hesitate for a single second. He had spent the entire afternoon building a devastating legal strike. Drawing on his high-level corporate clearance and the offshore evidence I had just delivered, Clifford Haywood filed an emergency injunction with a federal judge. He did it under the guise of an imminent Securities and Exchange Commission audit. Before I take you into what happens next and what it cost the man who thought he had already won, let me ask you something. If someone had spent years hiding who they truly were, and that secret turned out to be the very thing that saved your life, would you feel grateful, or would the years of not knowing still sting? When you want to bring down a man like Grant, you do not simply lock his personal checking account. You sever his financial arteries. Clifford specifically targeted the Delaware shell companies Grant was using as his primary laundering operations. By classifying the sudden surge of anonymous foreign capital as a critical and immediate national security threat, Clifford cut straight through the usual slow drag of civil court proceedings. It was a ruthless, flawless legal maneuver. Within 20 minutes, a federal hold had been placed on every corporate asset tied to Grant's name. The money was trapped. The accounts were frozen solid. The shell companies were entirely dead. I kept the headphones on, listening closely to the live feed from Grant's coat pocket. He had parked his car and walked into an exclusive high-end restaurant in Charlotte, North Carolina. I could pick up the faint clink of expensive glassware and the soft drift of jazz from the dining room. Grant ordered a double bourbon, trying desperately to settle his frayed nerves. He was sitting there in the shadows, working out how to force my daughter back to sign the settlement papers. He still believed he had 48 hours to sort out his mounting problems. He thought he could still command the board and muscle his way out of the grave he had dug. He had absolutely no idea that his entire empire had just been erased with the stroke of a federal pen. I leaned back in my chair and drew a slow, deep breath. The trap had been executed without a flaw. Grant's money was completely gone. His power was nothing but an illusion, and his violent bosses were already watching the clock. I had severed his supply line without ever setting foot inside a courtroom. The beast was bleeding now, and the scent of it in the water was going to drive him out of his mind. He was about to understand that he had run completely out of options. And when a man like Grant reaches that realization, he makes the worst mistake of his life. I kept the headphones pressed tight against my ears, listening as Grant Kellner's world began to come apart at the seams. He was still perched at the bar of that upscale restaurant. I could hear the ambient hum of the dining room, quiet conversations, the ring of heavy crystal. Grant had moved on to a second double bourbon, trying to drown the rising tide of panic the 48-hour deadline had put in motion. He still thought he had time to patch things together. He still believed he could hold the board. "Sir, your bill," the bartender said, his tone polite but businesslike. I heard the creak of leather as Grant drew out his wallet. He laid down a heavy corporate credit card, the kind that ordinarily guaranteed immediate deference. A pause stretched out, filled by the soft noise of the restaurant. Then the bartender came back, and the Polish in his voice had been replaced by a cool professional edge. "I'm sorry, sir," the bartender said. "This card has been declined." Declined? Grant's voice jumped immediately into arrogant indignation. "That is impossible. Run it again. There is no limit on that account." "I did run it again, sir," the bartender replied. "The terminal shows the account has been frozen by the issuer. Do you have another form of payment?" I could hear the frantic shuffling as Grant tore through his wallet, pulling out a personal platinum card. "Here," he muttered, irritated. "Use this one and bring me another drink." The silence that followed moved at an agonizing crawl. I pictured Grant sitting there, straightening the cuffs of his expensive suit, trying to hold on to his air of invincibility, while his pulse climbed a little faster. The bartender returned, and this time he made no effort to soften his tone. "Sir, this card is also declined. The terminal is flagging a total asset freeze across all accounts linked to your name. You'll need to provide another form of payment immediately, or I'll have to bring the manager over." Grant did not push back this time. The realization landed on him like a physical blow. The arrogant bluster drained out of him completely. I heard him scramble desperately, pulling a wad of emergency cash from his money clip, slapping it down on the bar, and nearly running out of the restaurant. The audio feed caught the sound of his heavy breathing as he moved at a sprint across the pavement toward his car. He yanked the door shut behind him, sealing himself inside the quiet cabin. He began dialing immediately. He reached his primary financial controller, his voice stripped raw with fear. "Why are my cards declining? One stedif decides." Grant demanded the moment the call connected. "Why is the bank telling me my accounts are frozen?" The controller sounded utterly terrified. "Grant, I don't know what's happening," he stammered. "The banks aren't talking to us. The holding accounts in Delaware are completely locked. I tried to access the corporate portal, and it's showing a federal injunction notice. The Securities and Exchange Commission has launched an emergency audit. Grant, they've frozen everything. Every single dollar is trapped." Grant made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a scream. "The SEC," he choked out. "How were the offshore transfers were clean? We broke the deposits down exactly the way they told us to." "It wasn't a random flag," Grant of the controller said, his voice dropping to a shaking whisper. "The injunction specifically targeted the primary holding entity, the one registered under Celia Pruitt's name." Grant dropped the phone. I heard it strike the center console of his car. He began to hyperventilate, pulling at the air in ragged gulps as the walls of his carefully constructed world collapsed around him. The money was gone. The shell company was dead. The federal government was tearing through his ledgers at that very moment, and the worst realization of all was just beginning to surface. His secondary burner phone started ringing. The sharp electronic tone cut through the silence of the car. It was the secure line he reserved exclusively for his offshore handlers. Grant stared at it. I could hear his ragged breathing as he sat there too frightened to answer. The phone rang on, relentless and demanding. Finally, he picked it up, his hand shaking so hard the phone rattled against his ear. "Kellner." The cold, flat voice of his syndicate handler came through the speaker. "We are receiving notification from our domestic contractors. The holding accounts are locked. The capital transfers have failed. Explain this immediately." "It is a mistake," Grant stammered, his voice pitching high with panic. "It is a temporary hold. The bank flagged a routine anomaly. I can fix it. I just need a few hours." The handler cut him off, and the utter absence of emotion in the man's voice was chilling. "It is not a bank anomaly, Kellner. We ran a shadow check on the corporate registration. The SEC has initiated a federal freeze. You exposed the pipeline. You lost our money." "No, no. Listen to me." Grant begged, tears completely choking his words. "It was not me. I did not expose anything. It was her. It was Celia. She is the registered officer on that account. She discovered the offshore deposits. She ran this morning. She must have gone to the police. She is the one who flagged the accounts. I can fix this. I can find her. I can make her retract everything. Please just give me until tonight." "We do not grant extensions, Kellner," the handler said, his voice falling to a deadly calm. "You have until midnight to recover the capital and secure the registered officer. If the freeze is not lifted by 12:01, you are entirely expendable. The cleanup protocol will be initiated." The line went dead. Grant sat alone in the dark, silent car, sobbing without restraint. He He was completely broken. His money, his power, his whole arrogant facade had been stripped away in a matter of hours. He was a dead man walking, and somewhere beneath the panic, he knew it. But a cornered animal is still dangerous. Grant's panic began curdling into a violent, desperate paranoia. He was convinced Celia had gone to the authorities. He believed she had single-handedly brought down his empire. In his mind, she was the only loose thread standing between him and execution at the hands of his syndicate bosses. He knew nothing about me. He had no idea about the federal tracking devices or the legal team I had turned loose on him. All he understood was that he had to silence my daughter before midnight. I listened as Grant picked up his phone again. His hands were still trembling, but something in his voice had gone cold and ugly. He pulled up his messages and began typing furiously. I knew exactly what he was writing. He was putting together his final desperate ultimatum. The trap was perfectly laid. The beast was bleeding hard, and it was about to come charging blind into the dark. I listened through those heavy black headphones as the silence inside Grant's car stretched out like a wire pulled too tight. He had just ended the call with his syndicate handlers. The 48-hour deadline hung over him like a blade. But the truth of his situation was far grimmer than that. He did not have 48 hours. His domestic accounts were frozen solid. His offshore deposits were bouncing back. He had no way whatsoever to reach the capital he needed to save his own life. The panic that had been pushing him forward began curdling into something else entirely. I could hear it in the sudden erratic rhythm of his breathing. The frantic gasping slowed, replaced by the long, measured exhales of a man who has exhausted every option. When a predator understands it is cornered, it stops trying to find an exit and starts looking for something to destroy. I heard the sharp metallic snap of his car's center console coming open. There was a heavy thud of something solid being moved, followed by the unmistakable slide and rack of a pistol being chambered. He was checking a weapon. A cold, familiar stillness moved through me. Grant was no longer functioning as a corrupt businessman trying to salvage what was left of his empire. He had crossed over into raw violence. He picked up his phone again. Keys tapped rapidly as he typed. I already knew who he was messaging before the notification even lit up on my daughter's phone down the hall. I pulled the headphones off and left the study, moving quickly toward the living room. Celia was on the sofa, with her knees drawn tight against her chest, staring blankly at the dark screen of her phone sitting on the coffee table. Lorraine was beside her with an open book, but her posture was taut, her eyes working the tree line beyond the window in a steady scan. The phone screen flared with a hard buzz. Celia flinched, letting out a small, involuntary gasp. She reached for the phone, her hand shaking badly enough that she nearly fumbled it. She looked at the screen for a long moment, the color leaving her face in a slow drain. Her breath caught, and a single tear broke free and traced a quiet line down her cheek. "What does it say?" Lorraine asked, her voice calm, but carrying an edge. Celia looked up at me, her eyes wide and filled with absolute terror. She extended the phone toward me, her hand trembling badly. I took it and read the glowing screen. The message from Grant was short and stripped of his usual arrogant posturing. It read, "I know what you did. I am coming to the cabin tonight. No cops or you are all dead." He was not coming to negotiate. He was not coming to drag her back to Charlotte to sign fraudulent settlement papers. He had convinced himself that Celia was the sole reason his laundering operation had come apart. He believed she had gone to the authorities and blown the syndicate's pipeline wide open. In his panicked, unraveling mind, silencing her was the only proof of loyalty he had left, to offer his offshore bosses the only move that might buy him a few more hours to run. "He wants to kill us," Celia whispered, her voice barely holding together. "He actually wants to kill us. Dad, we have to go. We have to grab whatever we can and get out right now. We can stay at a hotel. We can cross into another state. We just cannot be sitting here when he pulls up." She got to her feet in a rush, her eyes sweeping the room as if an exit might materialize from the walls. The terror had taken complete hold of her, overriding any ability to think in a straight line. I put a firm, steady hand on her shoulder and brought her to a stop. "We are not running, Celia," I said, my voice low and absolutely even. "Are you insane?" she cried, tears running freely down her face. "He has a gun, Dad. I know he has one. He told me once he bought it for protection. If he comes through that door, he is not going to talk. He is going to hurt you. He is going to hurt Mom. And every bit of it is my fault." I looked at my daughter and let the full weight of my calm press against her rising hysteria. I had spent 30 years watching frightened people try to outrun monsters. Running never works. It only moves the confrontation to a different address. When you run, you surrender every tactical advantage you have. You hand the predator the choice of time and place. Grant thinks we are prey, I said, keeping my tone perfectly level. He thinks he is driving up here to find a terrified woman and two helpless old people cowering in the dark. If we run, he owns the story. He will track us down because he has absolutely nothing left to lose. Then what do we do? She sobbed, wrapping her arms around herself. We cannot fight him. Lorraine stood up from the sofa. She crossed the room and gently took Celia's tear-streaked face in both hands. You need to listen to your father, Lorraine said, her voice carrying the quiet, unmistakable authority of a woman who had spent decades putting dangerous men in federal prison. Grant Kellner is a desperate amateur running a game he does not understand. Your father is the professional who wrote the rules. Celia blinked, her gaze moving back and forth between us. The confusion cut briefly through the terror. What do you mean? She asked. I released her shoulder and moved to the large front window, looking out at the fading light falling across the dense woods that ringed our property. Grant had made his choice. He had decided to take this from a financial dispute to an armed confrontation. He believed he was driving to our home to commit murder. I am going to make a phone call, I said, turning back to face my daughter, and then we are going to get ready for company. Grant wants to come to the cabin tonight. We are going to let him come. We are going to let him walk right up to the front door, and then we are going to show him exactly what happens when you threaten the wrong family. Celia could not hold still. She paced the length of the living room, her hands raking through her hair. She kept picking things up from the coffee table, a coaster, a magazine, a decorative candle, and setting them back down just as fast. Her mind was completely fractured by the weight of Grant's message. He was coming tonight. He had a gun. He intended to kill us. Dad, please, she begged, turning to me with tears streaming down her face. We have the truck. We can just go. Find a motel off the interstate. Call the local police from the road and tell them he broke into the house. Please do not make us stay here. If he brings people from his company, we do not stand a chance. I let her get it all out. When someone is drowning in panic, you do not talk over them. You wait until they have run out of breath, and then you throw them the line. Lorraine stood quietly near the fireplace, arms crossed, holding that unbreakable calm she had built over years of prosecuting violent men. She did not coddle Celia this time. She just watched me, knowing it was precisely the right moment to pull the curtain back. Celia, I said, my voice soft but weighted in a way that stopped her pacing cold. Come over here and sit down. She hesitated, her eyes cutting toward the front door. Dad, there is no time to sit, she said. Sit down, Celia, Lorraine said. It was not a request. It was the tone of a woman who had commanded federal courtrooms. Celia blinked at her mother's sudden authority and slowly settled onto the edge of the sofa. I crossed to the large oak bookcase built into the far wall of the living room. It held decades of classic novels, photo albums, and dusty encyclopedias. I reached behind a thick leather-bound volume of historical biographies and pressed a hidden latch. With a soft mechanical click, a section of the shelving swung forward and pivoted open like a heavy door. Celia let out a small, startled gasp. Behind the false bookcase was a recessed alcove lined with matte black steel. Inside the alcove sat a wide, high-definition surveillance monitor, alongside a complex communications terminal that looked entirely out of place in our rustic mountain cabin. The screen was divided into more than a dozen separate grids, each one displaying a crystal-clear night vision, feed of the deep woods, the gravel driveway, the main access road, and the perimeter gate. What is that? Celia whispered, her eyes fixed on the glowing screens. Are those cameras on our property? I did not answer right away. I reached into the alcove and lifted open a small, reinforced lockbox sitting on the shelf below the monitor. Inside, my hand found the heavy, familiar weight of solid silver and brass. I drew it out, holding it loosely in my right hand, and walked back to where my daughter sat at the coffee table. I stood before her for a moment, letting the silence settle over the room. Then, I slowly opened my hand and set the object down on the polished wood in front of her. It landed with a heavy metallic thud, a solid silver star set inside a brass circle deeply engraved with the seal of the United States government. The words, United States Marshal, gleamed under the soft glow of the living room lamps. Celia stared at the badge. She looked at the silver star, then up at the surveillance monitors showing our property, then back down at the badge again. Her mind was struggling to reconcile the fragile, retired old man she had known her entire life with the federal insignia sitting on the table in front of her. "Dad!" She stammered, her voice barely audible. "What is this? Where did this come from? How did you—" I pulled a chair over and sat directly across from her. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees. "I earned it," I said, keeping my voice completely steady. "I spent 30 years earning it. I know you believed I worked some quiet administrative job for the government. I know you pictured me pushing paper in a dull office building until I got too old and retired out here. But that was a story we told you to keep you safe so you could grow up with a normal life." She shook her head slowly, trying to absorb the scale of it. "You were a police officer?" she asked. "No," Lorraine answered, stepping forward and resting a hand on my shoulder. "Your father was not a police officer, Celia. Local police officers write traffic citations and answer domestic calls. Your father was a federal fugitive investigator." I met my daughter's eyes and let her look past the denim work shirt and the gray hair. "Grant thinks he is driving up here to terrorize a helpless family," I said. "He thinks he is a powerful man because he launders money for a syndicate and bought himself a local judge. But Grant is nothing but an amateur playing a very dangerous game. He told you no cops because he believes he can control the situation. He has no idea I already planted a federal tracking device on him at the grocery store. He has no idea I froze all his offshore accounts this afternoon." Celia's hands flew to her mouth. "You froze his accounts," she managed. "That is why he is this furious. That is why he is coming." "He is coming because he is a cornered rat," I said flatly. "He is terrified of the men he answers to. And he has convinced himself that killing you is the only way left to cover his tracks. He thinks tonight he is the predator. But I have spent 3 decades hunting the most violent men on this planet. Men who ran cartels, men who dissolved into jungles and vanished, men who were certain they could never be touched. I brought every single one of them in." I pointed toward the glowing surveillance monitor behind me. "Those cameras are military-grade, sweetheart. They cover every inch of this property. I have sensors buried in the driveway that register the exact weight of any vehicle rolling through the gate. Grant is driving up here completely blind. He is walking into a fortified federal perimeter that I designed and built myself." Celia watched the silent green feeds of the dark woods moving across the monitors. The frantic terror that had been consuming her began to pull back slowly, giving way to a deep, staggering shock. The man who had dominated her life, destroyed her finances, and threatened to leave her parents on the street was walking into a trap built by an apex predator. "Are you going to shoot him?" she asked. Her voice was still unsteady, but something underneath it had gone quiet. I exhaled slowly. "I am not going to need to shoot him," I told her. "I am going to let him breach the property. I am going to let him come right up to this porch and make his threats. He is going to commit federal crimes on camera and establish his intent to kill. And then we are going to drop a cage on him so heavy he will never see the outside of a prison wall for what remains of his miserable life." I got to my feet and lifted the silver badge from the coffee table. I slipped it into my pocket, feeling the familiar weight settle against my hip. I looked down at my daughter and watched the understanding finally take root in her eyes. She was no longer a victim waiting to be rescued. She was standing behind a shield she had never known was there. "Do not pack your bags, Celia," I said, letting my voice carry the full weight of what I meant. "We are not running from Grant Kellner. We are going to finish him." Dale walked out of the living room and down the hallway to place his call to the task force commander. The heavy silence he left in his wake was broken only by the soft electronic hum of the surveillance equipment concealed in the wall. Celia kept her eyes on the glowing green screens, watching the still woods. She held her own arms around herself, trembling, though not entirely from fear anymore. The revelation had rewritten everything she thought she understood about her own life. Lorraine moved quietly across the room and settled beside their daughter. She smoothed a loose strand of hair behind Celia's ear, her touch gentle and grounded in absolute certainty. Lorraine had spent her career facing down murderers and extortionists in federal courtrooms. She knew how to take apart a panic piece by piece. "How long have you known?" Celia whispered, not pulling her gaze from the camera feeds. "Since the day I met him," Lorraine answered, her voice carrying a warm, unhurried steadiness. "I was a junior federal prosecutor working a massive racketeering case. We had a cartel boss who had slipped the net and disappeared into the deep wilderness of the Great Smoky Mountains. Local law enforcement could not locate him. The federal tracking teams lost his trail inside of 3 days. He had millions of dollars and a private army keeping him protected. We believed he was gone for good. Celia finally turned to look at her mother. "And Dad found him?" she asked. Lorraine smiled, small, quiet, deeply proud. "Your father did not just find him, Celia. The Marshal Service sent your father in alone. He did not put on a suit or sit behind a desk. He slipped into the mountains for 3 weeks. He lived in the dirt and the freezing rain, reading footprints and snapped branches that no one else could even identify. He survived on ration bars and river water, holding his position until the perfect moment arrived. When he finally walked that cartel boss into my courtroom, the man was visibly shaken. He kept glancing back at your father, the way you look at something that hunted you through the dark. That was the moment I knew I was going to marry him," Lorraine confessed, her eyes softening with the memory. "I understood that a man carrying that kind of discipline and that kind of quiet strength would never allow anything to harm the people he loved." Lorraine reached out and took both of Celia's hands in hers. She wanted her daughter to fully grasp the gap between the man heading toward them and the man waiting on the porch. "We told you he was a low-level government administrator because the truth was too dangerous to carry," Lorraine explained quietly. "We wanted you to go to school, make friends and sleep without lying awake, worrying that someone your father had sent to a maximum security prison might one day come looking for payback. But your father was part of a special operations group. He was the operative they called in when targets were too violent or too elusive for a standard strike team." Celia listened, her breathing gradually slowing, as the reality of her father's past began to displace her lingering terror of Grant Kellner. "He hunted men who believed they were gods." Lorraine continued, keeping her tone perfectly measured. "He tracked human traffickers through the punishing heat of the Sonoran Desert. He pursued domestic terrorists, dug into the deep mountains of Montana, wearing them down until the brutal winter broke their will. He pulled fugitive arms dealers out of fortified compounds in the Rockies. These were men commanding private militias and controlling vast flows of dirty money. They had heavy firepower and zero hesitation. Every single one of them was convinced he was untouchable. Every one of them believed his money, and his brutality made him invincible. And every one of them discovered how wrong that was the moment your father stepped out of the tree line and put them in irons." Lorraine paused, letting the weight of those words settle deep into Celia's mind. She needed her daughter to shed entirely the illusion of power Grant had held over her. "Grant Kellner is not a cartel boss," Lorraine said, her voice sharpening with quiet contempt. "Grant is a spoiled, arrogant boy in a very expensive suit. He plays with syndicate money because it makes him feel significant, but he does not know the first thing about real survival. He leans on screaming and lawsuits because he has no genuine strength behind him. He operates entirely on intimidation. He mistakes frightening a civilian for being a dangerous man." Celia turned her gaze back to the monitors, eyes moving along the dark ribbon of gravel that wound toward the house. "He mentioned he wasn't coming alone," she said softly, old fear nudging at the edges of her voice. "He said, 'No cops,' or 'we are all dead.'" Lorraine answered with a short, easy laugh, the kind that had no room in it for worry. "Good, let him bring whoever he wants," she said. "The men Grant rounded up tonight are bottom-rung hired hands chasing fast cash. They think they're showing up to batter down a door and put the fear of God into a pair of retirees. What none of them understand is that they're marching straight into a carefully constructed ambush built by someone who once schooled federal agents on how to hit a target hard and clean. Patience is your father's weapon of choice," Lorraine told her, folding Celia's hands inside her own. "Men cut from Grant's cloth always stumble. Their pride can't absorb the shock of losing the wheel. Everything they do comes from bluster and impulse. They barrel in loud, flinging threats, burning bridges, leaving a trail a blind man could follow. Your father operates differently. He doesn't threaten. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't give a single thing away before he's ready. He holds still. He studies the ground beneath his feet. He maps every angle and waits for the other man to walk himself into a corner with no exit. For the past 48 hours, he'd been steadily dismantling each layer of protection Grant Kellner imagined he had. Lorraine freed Celia's hands and pointed toward the bank of glowing screens cutting through the dim alcove. "Those screens, Celia. Your father wired every inch of this setup with his own hands. Each camera, each motion sensor, every hardened bolt and reinforced entry point on this land was built to absorb and defeat an organized strike. We didn't come out here to vanish into the trees. We came because your father wanted the high ground tactically and in every other sense. Grant believes he's steering toward an easy execution, two old people alone in the dark. What he's actually steering toward is a federal kill box, with his name already written on it. Celia pulled in a long breath. The shaking that had gripped her shoulders went quiet. The frightened, cornered woman Grant had stalked through the grocery store no longer existed in this room. She straightened her spine against the sofa, back shoulders squared. Every word about jungle manhunts and dismantled cartels had worked exactly the way Lorraine had planned. Grant Kellner had been reduced, shrunk down to something manageable. "He's going to prison, isn't he?" Celia said, and her voice came out solid, not a waver in it. Lorraine's smile returned measured certain, the expression of someone who had watched justice land on the right people for 30-plus years. "Federal penitentiary," she said. "He's going to watch his money disappear, his freedom disappear, and eventually his sanity. Every day for the rest of that miserable life, he'll sit with the knowledge that the fragile old man he knocked onto a supermarket floor engineered his complete and total ruin. Deep breath now, sweetheart. Your father is nearly off that call, and we need to be ready when company arrives." I left Celia on the sofa, the pale wash of the surveillance screens caught in her wide, shell-shocked eyes. Lorraine remained close, a steady presence holding the center of the room. I moved down the hall to my study, the old familiar cadence of operational readiness filling my chest like slow, expanding warmth. Fear had cleared out entirely. Adrenaline had cleared out with it. What was left had a temperature to it, cold and razor-sharp. I pulled the encrypted satellite phone from its cradle. The small green display threw pale light across the desktop's dark grain. I entered a string of digits that would never ping a commercial cell tower. The signal was threading through a hardened military relay, routed around every civilian network on the continent. One ring that was all, and then a blunt, no-nonsense voice came through the line. Doyle Beckham, Deputy Director of Operations, United States Marshal Service. 30 years before he'd stood beside me as tactical commander on the cartel task force. We'd crawled through the same dirt, chasing men who'd convinced themselves the world owed them everything. We'd taken wounds together. We'd endured cold that bit to the marrow together. We'd hauled predators out of places that didn't appear on any map together. "Dale!" He said, the official clipped tone gone the moment he heard me. "That encrypted package hit my desk this afternoon. My money people are all over it as we speak. You just dropped the offshore routing architecture for a network we've been circling for 5 years. Please tell me you're not running this from a live firefight." "Nobody's shooting at me, Doyle," I said, steady and unhurried. "Though I'm expecting some uninvited company at my place here in the Blue Ridge foothills of western North Carolina before the night's done." Doyle produced a low, rough sound that was shaped like a laugh, but contained none of the warmth. "Company," he said again. "Dale walked me through why a man pokes a hornet's nest solo. I laid it out for him, every piece, every angle. Grant Kellner, mid-level real estate player, moving dirty syndicate money, now staring at frozen accounts and a world closing in. He'd decided my daughter was the one who'd burned him. He'd fired off a text that amounted to a death sentence promising to show up tonight at my cabin with armed backup." Doyle went silent on his end, the kind of silence that has real weight to it. When he came back, the warmth was gone, and what was left was the commander, the one I'd served under when it counted. "He came at your family." Not a question, a statement. "He did," I said. "Told Celia, no cops or we are all dead. In his mind, he's rolling up here to rough up a scared old man and a woman alone. He figures the bodies he's bringing give him the edge." Doyle exhaled long, deliberate, controlled. "That makes him a dead man, Dale. Sets foot on your land with a weapon and you are legally covered to put him down. You want me to have a highway unit box him in before he even reaches you." "No," I said, shifting back in my chair. "Roadside intercept, and he folds immediately, lawyers up before dawn." Suddenly, the threatening message was a joke that got taken wrong. Suddenly, he was just passing through the neighborhood. "He's got a crooked judge in his corner." Judge Holcomb's name sat unspoken between us. "He'll tie Celia up in court for years, and there's a real chance his legal team unravels the financial case if they get enough time to work it. I need him past the gate, Doyle. I need him inside." "You want the trap to close around him." Doyle had it immediately. "I want him through the perimeter," I said. Coming up the drive, weapon out, murder on his mind, and all of it feeding directly to the military-grade cameras I put up this morning. But I'm not looking to be the one who ends this. If he dies here, the people above him in that syndicate send someone with actual training. I want Grant Kellner breathing cuffed and sitting across a federal intake table so he can begin to understand the magnitude of where his arrogance landed him. I need a containment crew, Doyle. People who know how to ghost through heavy timber and take a man down clean without a shot. I need a cordon so complete, nothing breathes its way off this property without your people knowing. Already moving, Dale, Doyle said I could hear the keyboard under his fingers. Rapid response unit is sitting at a federal staging point 40 miles out. I'm spinning them up now. Unmarked vehicles fully blacked out on approach perimeter, set in the tree line around your structure. No radio chatter, no light, just quiet professionals doing quiet work. Grateful, Doyle. Have the team lead come up on frequency delta. I'll cross-reference their position against my sensor grid. 90 minutes, Dale, he said. Stay low. Let the cage do the work. I put the satellite phone away in its hidden compartment and sat for a moment in the silence. Everything was fixed and in motion. The full machinery of federal law enforcement was now rolling toward this mountain. Grant Kellner convinced he was the hunter. Closing in on prey was, in fact, the mouse entering a trap built by people with decades of practice building them. I came back through into the living room. Celia hadn't moved from the sofa, attention riveted to the monitor bank. The fear had evacuated completely, and what had replaced it was something slower and deeper, the dawning comprehension of who exactly had raised her. Lorraine appeared from the kitchen, a heavy enamel mug in each hand, both trailing steam. She passed one to Celia and held the other out to me. We're in motion, I said to Lorraine, wrapping my hands around the mug. Doyle's got a tactical team en route. Tree line 90 minutes. Lorraine acknowledged that with a single nod and brought her coffee to her lips, unhurried. No sign of nerves anywhere on her face. She wore the expression of someone who had already made her peace with the night. Lovely evening for a drive, she said quietly, gazing out through the front window at the wall of black trees beyond. I crossed the room to the heavy locked cabinet beside the fireplace. A short combination, and the solid steel doors swung open. Inside, cradled on padded mounts, sat a customized 12-gauge tactical shotgun, a beautiful instrument kept in flawless condition and capable of ending an argument at close range with absolute finality. I drew it out, running through the chamber and safety checks with the ease of long practice. I had no intention of firing it tonight. Doyle's team would handle the actual takedown, but inviting a wolf through your gate and keeping no teeth of your own nearby is a fool's calculation. I slung the shotgun across my shoulder and moved toward the front door. Celia rose from the sofa, watching me with wide eyes. "Dad," she said barely above a whisper. "Where are you going?" "Out for some air, sweetheart," I told her, giving her the kind of smile meant to hold someone steady. "The night's cool and the coffee's still hot. Stay inside with your mother. Keep your eyes on those screens. Whatever sounds you pick up out there, you do not open this door." I pushed through onto the wide wooden porch, pulling it shut behind me. The air outside had that crisp mountain bite to it, pine resin and damp soil carried on a light breeze. The surrounding woods held no sound at all, just a solid, unbroken curtain of dark. I made my way to my old wooden porch chair, the one that had held me through 100 quiet evenings since I'd traded the work for the mountains. I settled into it, laying the shotgun across my lap, angling it so the porch railing's shadow swallowed it whole. I lifted my heavy enamel mug and took a slow pull of black coffee, letting my eyes trace the gravel drive all the way to the main gate. The single dim bulb above the porch door spilled a weak yellow circle across the planks at my feet, leaving everything beyond, including me, wrapped in darkness. I let the stillness of the woods settle around me. The trap was built. The perimeter sensors were live. Doyle's people were threading through the trees somewhere out in that dark. Grant Kellner was coming, a desperate, ego-driven man, charging straight toward the end of everything he'd ever had. I took another sip and let my palm rest easy against the cool steel of the barrel. All that was left was the waiting. The iron gate at the property entrance was built to absorb serious force, but I deliberately left the primary electronic lock disengaged. I wanted Grant to feel the weight of that chain, wanted him to believe he was muscling his way through, rather than walking into something designed to receive him. At exactly 2:14 in the morning, the silent perimeter alarms threw a rapid cascade of red alerts across the concealed monitor inside. I was still in my old wooden porch chair shotgun, resting unseen in the shadows across my thighs. The one dim yellow bulb touched the boards close around me. Beyond that, the long gravel drive and the rest of the porch dissolved into the total darkness of a mountain night. Then the engine sound reached me, heavy low and aggressive shouldering through the whisper of the pines. The black pickup truck with heavily tinted windows never slowed for the gate. It punched the accelerator, the steel push bar on the front bumper meeting the iron gate with a crash that rang through the hills like a cannon shot. The chain gave the gates blew inward and the truck churned up the driveway in a boiling wake of dust and loose stone. No cautious parking at the tree line, Grant was running on raw adrenaline and unraveling nerves. He stood on the brakes and skidded to a stop, roughly 50 feet from where I sat. The engine stayed running a low, ugly growl in the blackness. All the doors opened at once. 3 shapes moved into the bleed of the headlights. Grant Kellner came out from behind the wheel. Gone was the tailored suit, the careful executive presentation. He had on a dark, heavy jacket, and his face had collapsed into something feral, the expression of a man who understood his world was burning and had settled on violence as the only shovel left. His right hand was locked around a heavy steel tire iron grip, so tight his knuckles had gone bloodless. He was pulling hard for air chest, working like bellows, the kind of breathing that comes from panic eating a man from the inside out. He looked like someone who had made a decision he couldn't walk back from. The other 2 came out of the passenger side and rear door. One look told me everything. These weren't bar pickups or neighborhood muscle. They moved with the measured, deliberate awareness of trained men scanning sightlines, weight-forward hands drifting close to their waistbands. Syndicate muscle sent to make sure Grant cleaned up his mess before the deadline caught him. The dull glint of heavy-caliber semi-automatics at their belts confirmed it. Grant didn't wait for them to get organized. He set off straight up the gravel drive, boots punching loud against the stones, eyes fixed on the cabin's front door. In his mind, there was a locked door to break through, a terrified woman to drag out, and one old man too frightened to resist. He hadn't registered me at all. I was just a shadow in the shadow of the porch until he'd eaten up half the driveway. I brought the heavy enamel mug to my lips and took a slow, unhurried sip. The soft contact of ceramic against the wooden armrest rang out clean and sharp through the truck's idling rumble. Grant's feet stopped. He pushed his chin forward, squinting into the thin yellow light, trying to assemble what he was seeing. The 2 enforcers spread wide, without a word flanking him, hands hovering just clear of their weapons. Professionals, but unsettled ones. When your breach plan assumes a panicked household, and instead, you find the target sitting alone in the dark, nursing a hot drink, that gap between expectation and reality does something to your timing. Well, Grant, I said, my voice coming out smooth and low, not a tremor in it. I'll give you credit for punctuality, though I have to say you're doing a number on my driveway. Grant's stare fixed on me. His chest kept heaving. The tire iron rose an inch in his fist. Whatever control had built his career was gone, stripped down to something cornered and erratic. "Where is she?" he shouted, voice fracturing at the top. "Where is Celia? Bring her out here right now, old man." He came forward another hard step, tire iron climbing higher. He had every expectation. I'd scrambled to my feet, plead bargain, the same broken posture he'd seen from me in that grocery store aisle. I didn't shift an inch, just raised the mug again, slow and deliberate, holding his eyes over the rim. "Just she's inside," I said, the same easy conversational tone. "She won't be coming out, and you won't be going in, so let's use the next few minutes wisely and talk this through before you cross a line you can't step back over. You think this is funny to you?" Grant's face had gone dark red, fury pressing against the skin. He leveled the heavy steel tire iron at my chest. "You froze my accounts. You dragged her out here to the middle of nowhere. I will beat you into this porch and then pull her out of that house myself." He hammered 2 more steps toward me, past all reason, nothing left in him but violent momentum. The 2 enforcers tightened up behind him, closing ground, setting up to support the push. In their minds, they had the field entirely covered. An old man, a dark porch, no resistance visible anywhere. What they didn't know was that each step up my gravel drive had been clock confirmed and drawn into the crosshairs of federal snipers already settled in the tree line less than 50 yards out. The breach was complete. Every target was standing inside the box. Time to close the lid. Grant Kellner pulled up at the base of the porch steps, tire iron white-knuckled in his hand chest, still hammering. The 2 syndicate men steadied on either side, palms resting against the grips of the pistols at their belts. They were working hard to project menace into the darkness around them, but I caught the tell in their stance, a slight stiffening, a recalculation happening behind the eyes. Trained men hate an unknown, and an unknown is exactly what they had found. A solitary old man sitting at ease drinking something hot with no apparent interest in their arrival. That's not a variable professionals enjoy. Grant, though, was past reading variables. He was running entirely on terror and the last burning fumes of his own rage. To him, I was still the same figure from that grocery store aisle, someone to shove aside and step over. "Where is she?" he bellowed, voice cracking at the peak tire iron pointing dead at my chest. "I'm done talking, old man. You bring Celia out here right now, or I swear to God, I'll haul you off that chair, beat you where you fall, and torch this cabin to the ground with your wife still inside." I didn't flinch. I didn't shift the shotgun resting hidden in the shadows across my lap. I simply raised my heavy enamel mug for another slow, deliberate pull, letting the silence unspool between us, making him live inside the total absence of fear on my face. "You're making a lot of noise, Grant," I said, voice low and smooth, not a crack in it. The words landed clean through his ragged breathing and out across the still porch. "But noise doesn't fix what's broken for you. All it does is mark your position for the wolves." Grant planted his foot on the first wooden step, tire iron climbing higher. The arrogance that had carried him through the lobby of his luxury apartment building made one last desperate bid to reassert itself. You think you're clever," he snarled, pushing up another step. "You freeze my accounts, drag her out here into the trees. I have men behind me, I have a weapon, and I will take apart everything you care about if you don't put her in front of me right now." He climbed a third step, and that was the ceiling I'd set for him. "You are carrying a debt of exactly $540,000 to the syndicate operating out of Cyprus." I said, my tone flat and precise, each word dropping into the night air like a stone into still water. Grant went rigid. His raised foot hung suspended frozen between steps. The tire iron dipped slightly as those numbers detonated somewhere inside his adrenaline-soaked brain. "Your primary holding entity in Delaware has been locked under a federal injunction initiated by the Securities and Exchange Commission." I continued running through the details with the detached accuracy of a man reading a damage report. "The offshore deposits have bounced back into the Cayman routing nodes. Your syndicate handlers have given you until exactly midnight to recover the capital." Grant's mouth worked open and shut without producing a sound. The blood drained out of his face so fast he looked translucent under the single weak porch bulb. And for the sake of complete accuracy on the timeline, I added, keeping my gaze locked onto his, "That deadline call reached you while you were sitting in your car outside a high-end Charlotte, North Carolina restaurant, right after 2 credit cards were declined at the table. You sat in that vehicle hyperventilating and crying before you sent a threatening text to my daughter." The 2 syndicate men behind him swapped a fast, alarmed look. They were hired to make sure a local developer cleaned up his exposure, not to listen to a man on a backcountry porch recite sealed international financial intelligence. Nobody had briefed them on how deep the collapse actually ran. Grant finally recovered enough to push words out, though what came out was barely above a shaken whisper. "Who are you?" I leaned forward, a single slow and measured movement. The dim yellow light caught the edge of my face. "I'm the man who dropped a federal GPS tracker and a microscopic audio transmitter into the right pocket of your custom-tailored overcoat while you were busy shoving me to the floor in a grocery store aisle," I said, letting a cold smile settle at the corners of my mouth. "I'm the man who has been listening to every frantic phone call you've made for the last 3 days. I'm the man who handed your entire offshore laundering operation directly to the United States government." Grant lurched backward, his boot slipping off the wooden step's edge. His hand went into his coat pocket and came out holding the 2 small black devices I had planted on him. He stood there staring at them in his open palm, the way a man stares at something that has just bitten him. The full weight of it hit all at once. He hadn't been pressing a frightened civilian into a corner. He hadn't been bending a fragile old man to his will. He had been an oblivious courier carrying a live federal listening post deep into the middle of his own criminal network. "You set me up!" Grant choked out, tears of raw panic breaking through. "You ruined me. They are going to kill me. They are going to kill me because of you." "You ruined yourself, Grant." I answered, my voice dropping into the cold, flat register I'd once used to inform men of their sentences. "You decided my daughter was a convenient shield for your dirty money. You threatened my family and leaned on a corrupt local judge to drown us in legal proceedings. You believed your bankroll and your ego made you untouchable. I reached over and set the heavy enamel mug down on the wooden side table. The sharp clink it made rang out through the charged silence like a small bell. But you forgot the first rule of the woods, Grant. I told him, the certainty in my voice nailing him where he stood. If you're going to come hunting, you had better know exactly what is already waiting for you in the dark. Grant dropped his eyes to the tracker sitting in his palm, then raised them to the dark, solid mass of the cabin rising above me. Whatever calculation had been holding the cornered animal inside him in check finally gave way entirely. He let out a sound that was equal parts scream and sob, re-gripping the tire iron with both hands. He swung toward the two enforcers behind him, jabbing the steel bar in my direction. "Kill him!" he screamed, voice breaking apart at the edges. "Kill him right now and burn this place down. No witnesses, kill him now." The enforcers' hands tightened on their weapons, but neither moved. It didn't matter. Grant's order was the final variable I had been waiting on. He had just directed 2 armed men to commit murder on my property. He had crossed every remaining threshold. The breach was complete. The trap was loaded and ready. I did not reach for the shotgun. I did not rise from the old wooden porch chair. I reached into the pocket of my denim work shirt, drew out a small black remote, and pressed the single red button. That one press set off 90 minutes of careful preparation. I stayed in my chair and watched the cage snap shut. The entire property exploded in white. High-intensity tactical floodlights buried in the pine canopy overhead and along the cabin's roofline ignited all at once. The pitch-black mountain night ceased to exist. Every inch of the gravel drive, the front yard, and the iron gate was hammered by a harsh, merciless glare that turned 2 a.m. into high noon. The violence of that light shift was physically staggering. Grant shrieked and threw both arms across his face, and the tire iron rang off the wooden steps as it fell from his hands. The 2 syndicate enforcers slammed their eyes shut, arms snapping up to block the assault on their vision. Their hands jerked away from their waistbands. Blinded and disoriented, they were neutralized before a single shot had been considered. While their eyes were still fighting to function, a new element entered the picture. Threading through the wall of white light came dozens of tight crimson points. Laser sights sliced the dust churned up by the idling truck's engine, skipping across the gravel before locking onto their marks with absolute precision. 4 red dots settled over the chest of the enforcer on the left, 4 more fixed on the forehead and torso of the one on the right. And a cluster of a dozen bright lasers converged directly over Grant Kellner's hammering heart. From the tree line on every side, shadows began to detach themselves from the woods. They moved without a whisper of sound. Heavily armored tactical operators in dark combat gear stepped into the floodlit clearing rifles raised and perfectly steady. Behind them came figures in windbreakers, bold yellow letters marking them as FBI and United States Marshal Service. The perimeter had folded inward, sealing the driveway and cutting off any remaining thought of escape. Doyle Beckham came around from behind the black pickup truck. He moved at the unhurried pace of a man carrying the full weight of federal authority and comfortable with it. A radio was in his hand, but he didn't need to raise his voice. It came through the megaphone with clean carrying force. "Federal agents," Doyle announced, his voice rolling across the property. "Drop your weapons and get on the ground, now." The 2 syndicate enforcers were experienced men. They understood the difference between a routine local standoff and a precision federal kill box assembled by professionals. They knew that any movement toward their weapons would bring the snipers in the trees down on them before their fingers made contact with the grip. They didn't deliberate. Hands rose, slowly pistols were kicked away across the gravel, and both men went to their knees and then flat onto the dirt. Federal operators moved in fast, snapping cold steel cuffs onto their wrists and pulling them clear of the vehicles. Grant Kellner was left standing alone at the foot of the porch steps. The full crushing weight of what had happened landed on him all at once. He lowered his arms from his face, blinking into the punishing light. He took in his hired muscle, stretched out and cuffed on the gravel. He took in the ring of armored federal agents with weapons leveled at him. He looked down at the constellation of red laser points burning through his jacket. His arrogance didn't just crack, it ceased to exist. The wealthy, insulated real estate player who had made my daughter's life a nightmare was gone without a trace. The man who'd boasted about owning judges and grinding people into dust had been erased entirely. What remained was a frightened child who had wandered into a game whose rules he'd never understood. Grant let out a ragged, suffocating sob. His legs gave out beneath him, and he went down hard onto the sharp gravel, the same stones he'd been marching up with such purpose just moments before. He folded himself inward, arms wrapped around his own stomach. Tears ran freely down his face and dripped into the dirt below him. He was pulling for air in shallow, desperate gulps, a man coming completely undone. "Please," he wailed, voice climbing into something thin and pathetic. "Please don't shoot me. I'm sorry. I'll do whatever you need. I'll give you the money. Just, please don't let them kill me." He was bargaining, throwing his crumbling empire at the feet of the men holding rifles, trying to buy his way out of something money couldn't touch. He clawed at the gravel, begging for mercy. In that moment, he understood he wasn't simply going to prison. He'd led federal agents straight to the syndicate's money, and the people who owned that money would know exactly who walked them in. No matter which direction he faced, he was already a dead man. I stayed in my old wooden porch chair, lifting the heavy enamel mug for a slow, measured sip. The operation had gone off without a flaw. The threat was gone, and my family was whole. I watched as Doyle signaled 2 agents to move in and take custody of Grant. They gripped him under the arms, peeled his weeping, boneless form off the gravel, and locked his wrists behind his back. The era of Grant Kellner was finished. I rose from the porch chair and left the heavy enamel mug on the small side table. The boards underfoot gave a soft creak as I moved toward the steps. The tactical floodlights still hammered the driveway with their cold white glare, throwing long, dark shadows across the gravel. Grant was on his knees in the middle of it, all ringed by armed federal agents' wrists bound tight behind him in thick steel cuffs. He was weeping, not the quiet inward weeping of a man reckoning with his own choices, but the ugly open-mouthed sobbing of a bully who had finally run out of people he could purchase or intimidate. I came down the porch steps unhurried. The federal operators moved aside without a word, opening a path. They knew who I was. They understood the unspoken weight of the moment. I stopped a few feet from Grant and looked down at him. His expensive jacket, the same one where I'd tucked the tracking device, was filthy ground into the dust and grit of my driveway. He lifted his face, eyes red and streaming, searching mine for some flicker of pity, some residue of the helpless old man he'd knocked down in a grocery aisle. He found nothing there. My eyes were flat and cold as river stones. "You told me you were going to burn my house down, Grant." I said, my voice low, but carrying cleanly through the night air. "You told me you were going to ruin my daughter and leave my wife with nothing. You thought your money made you untouchable, but you never once thought to ask what I did before I moved out here to these quiet woods." Grant dissolved into another violent sob, shaking his head back and forth. "Please," he managed, the word disintegrating as it left him. "I didn't know. I swear to you, I didn't know who you were. Tell them to let me go. I'll give you everything I have. I'll vanish." "Ignorance isn't a defense," I replied, steady and unhurried. "You chose to play in deep water with syndicate money. Now you get to drown in it. The federal government will put you in a concrete box for the remainder of your natural life. And the men whose money you lost tonight, they have friends inside those boxes. You will not know a single peaceful day for as long as you draw breath." I turned my back on him. He was no longer a threat. He was wreckage waiting to be hauled away. I gave a brief nod to Doyle Beckham, who stood a few feet off with his arms folded, watching the exchange. Doyle returned the nod and signaled his agents. They lifted Grant by the arms, moving his limp, sobbing frame toward a waiting armored transport. The 2 syndicate enforcers were already secured in the back, quiet and done fighting their fate. Doyle crossed to me and put out his hand. We shook the firm, wordless acknowledgement of 2 men who had spent their lives hunting and had just closed a good one. "We've got it from here, Dale," Doyle said, voice low and even. "My financial teams are already pulling apart his shell companies. We have enough to put him away for 50 years and enough offshore data to dismantle the entire syndicate pipeline. Good work tonight. Go inside and be with your family." Within 10 minutes, the tactical floodlights cut out. The heavy, unmarked vehicles rolled down the long gravel drive, one by one, and melted into the dark. The perimeter dissolved as quietly as it had materialized. The woods settled back into themselves, just the soft sway of pine boughs in the night breeze, nothing more. I turned and climbed the porch steps. The front door swung open. Celia came out onto the porch, Lorraine a step behind her. My daughter looked at the empty driveway where Grant had been crumbling in the dirt a few minutes before, and then her eyes came to me. The terror that had lived in her face for 6 months was gone, completely and irrevocably erased. What replaced it was a relief so deep it looked almost like disbelief. She crossed the porch in a few quick steps and put her arms around my neck, pressing her face into my shoulder. I pulled her in close and held her there. "It's over, sweetheart," I told her quietly, chin resting on the top of her head. "He is never going to hurt you again. I promise you that." Lorraine came and wrapped both arms around us, her head resting against my back. The three of us stood there on the quiet porch, a family that had been tested and had not broken. Time moves differently once the poison is pulled out. It has been over a year since that night on the porch, and the shape of our lives has changed considerably. Grant Kellner never saw the inside of a courtroom. Facing a wall of federal evidence, offshore financial records, and every word captured by the transmitter I'd slipped into his pocket, his expensive legal team folded immediately. He pled guilty to money laundering conspiracy to commit murder and a string of additional federal charges. He is currently serving a 60-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The syndicate network he'd served was completely dismantled by Doyle's task force, working off the routing numbers we handed them. Celia didn't merely survive what happened to her. She came out the other side stronger. Clifford Haywood, my trusted friend and sharp-minded attorney, delivered on every word he'd given her. He untangled her entirely from Grant's fraudulent shell companies and demonstrated to the federal courts that she was a victim of identity theft and corporate fraud. But Clifford didn't stop there. He filed a sweeping civil suit against Grant's remaining frozen assets for emotional distress and financial damages. The federal courts awarded Celia a settlement large enough that she will never need to worry about money again. She took that foundation and built something real, with it relocated to a beautiful coastal town and launched her own architectural design firm. She is independent, thriving, and fearless in a way she never was before. The frightened woman who packed a single battered nylon duffel bag in a Charlotte, North Carolina high-rise no longer exists. She knows her own value, and she knows without question that she has a family willing to overturn the world to keep her safe. She comes home to see us every month, and every time I notice her smile is brighter than the last. As for Lorraine and me, we are still here in the quiet woods of the Blue Ridge foothills of western North Carolina. The cracked living room window was replaced the very next morning. The perimeter cameras remain active, tucked out of sight deep in the hollows of the oak trees. Old habits don't let go. Easy. Some mornings, I settle into the old wooden porch chair with a hot, heavy enamel mug of black coffee and watch the sun climb slowly above the tall pines. I take in the birdsong and the wind threading through the branches. It is a quiet, peaceful life, and I mean to keep it exactly that way. I spent 30 years hunting the worst monsters this earth had to offer, and I earned every bit of this retirement. That is where this story ends, not with noise, not with chaos, but with a quiet porch, a hot mug, and a family standing whole on the other side of something that tried hard to break them. I have carried a lot of weight over the years. 30 years of hunting dangerous men, of keeping secrets from the people I loved, most of coming home and sitting in a porch chair and wondering whether it was all worth the cost. And then a night like that one comes along, and I believe God has a way of showing you that the long, hard road was always leading somewhere worth arriving at. The skills I spent a lifetime building were not wasted. They were just waiting for the moment they were needed most. If these grandpa revenge stories have taught me anything worth passing on, it is this. Never let a man's arrogance convince you that he has already won. Arrogance moves fast and loud, and it never looks where it is going. If you want to protect the people you love, do your work quietly, and let the other man do all the talking. A bully only holds power over you for as long as you let him believe you are afraid. The moment that changes, everything changes. And for the fathers out there, these father stories, we carry the things we have done in the dark to keep our families safe. They matter. Your children may not know the half of it, but they feel it. They feel it every time they know, without being able to explain, why that they are not alone in this world. If this story moves something in, you leave a thought in the comments. I read them, and they mean more than you might think. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Maybe a father, maybe someone who feels cornered and out of options. And if you haven't yet subscribed to Grandpa's Revenge, so the next one is waiting for you when you need it. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next one.